Now that you have a general understanding of how environmental conditions like temperature and rainfall vary around the Earth, we're now going to talk more specifically about how these environmental conditions impact an organism. Today we're going to be talking about temperature and how temperature, one, influences an organism, and two, how organisms might be able to survive in varying temperature conditions. First off, physical environment does influence whether or not an organism will be successful, as in they will survive, and in addition to survival, they need to also be able to reproduce. And it does this in two major ways. One, it determines how available energy resources are. So organisms need energy in order to be able to be successful. So the availability of those energy resources varies around the Earth, and this impacts directly their growth and reproduction. But also, because we've learned that environmental conditions can change dramatically, even within one area, extreme conditions might sometimes be more important because they're going to impact whether or not that organism can survive that particular extreme conditions. So how many days are extremely hot, extremely cold, how many days are extremely wet or extremely dry might impact an organism even more than the average distribution of those energy resources. So as we've been seeing in the last few sections, the two environmental factors that play the biggest role in determining distributions of organisms are temperature and rainfall. So temperature, whether it's hot or cold, and rainfall, which determines water availability. In this section, we're going to be looking specifically at temperature. In a future unit, we'll be looking more at how water influences organisms. So just some basics in case you haven't covered temperature in previous classes. You may have heard of the term heat before, and heat, most people don't have a very specific understanding of what heat is. They just think, oh, things are hot, things are cold. But what heat is it's actually a measure of energy, and a specific kind of energy called kinetic energy, and how much kinetic energy there is in a substance. Now, kinetic energy is energy that is related to motion. So as you see, this molecule here is moving, which means that it has kinetic energy. The faster something moves, the more kinetic energy it has. The slower something moves, the less kinetic energy it has. Now, since heat is a measure of this kinetic energy, substances or molecules that are moving faster have higher heat, and molecules that are moving slower have lower heat. Now, temperature is taking the heat within individual molecules and looking at how much of that heat is present in many molecules grouped together. So temperature is the average energy, the average heat of all of the molecules in a substance. So if you look at this graphic here, we have a flame source, so we have a source of energy. We also have a whole bunch of molecules. Now, the blue molecules are moving slowly, so they have low heat. The red molecules are moving much more rapidly, so they have high heat. Now, when most of the molecules in the area are blue, we would say that that has a low temperature. But when most of the molecules are red, that has a high temperature. So it's not just individual molecules anymore, it's now the average energy of all the molecules. So if on average molecules are moving rapidly, we have a higher temperature. Okay. Now this graphic also is an example of one way that energy can be transferred. You'll notice that molecules on the left start moving and they gradually bump into molecules on the right, and as they do, they begin to move as well. So this is called conduction of heat, and it's conducting the heat between the different molecules. Now there's several ways that heat can be either gained or lost from organisms, and those terms are radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. And before we get into the specifics of how energy impacts organisms and how organisms can survive in different temperature conditions, I want to look at how this heat energy is transferred between different organisms or even within different organisms. So the first one is radiation. So radiation, the definition of radiation is that it's the emission of electromagnetic waves from the surface of objects. So you can gain energy or lose energy through radiation without having to touch another object or organism. This is just the energy that is coming off of the organism or being emitted by the organism. So for instance, you might notice this if you have a hot stove and you hold your hand near it without touching it, you can feel the heat coming off of that stove. That is radiant heat. That is heat that is radiating away. You also might have things called radiators in your house to help warm your rooms during the winter. And what these do is they typically have something like water or steam flowing through them. It's heating up the metal of the radiator. Air then around the radiator heats up, and you can feel that heat coming off of the radiator without having to touch the metal of the radiator. So electromagnetic waves coming off of the surface of the object is radiation. Now, if you were to touch that radiator, you would be getting heat directly from the radiator in another mechanism called conduction. This is where you're directly contacting something that is cooler or warmer. And this can be through things like air or water, but it can be through direct contact. Okay, so you are touching that radiator. Similarly, if you were to touch the surface of the stove, you would be gaining heat through conduction rather than through radiation, where you don't have to touch the surface. Okay. So radiation, again, is without direct contact. It's electromagnetic waves that are emitted by the organism or object. Conduction is through direct contact, where you're actually physically coming into contact with that object or organism. Another way that heat can be transferred is through convection. Now, convection often goes along with things like radiation. It's transfer of heat by moving air or water. So you may have something called a convection oven in your home. This uses radiant heat to heat the oven, but there's also a fan, and what the fan does is it blows that energy around within the oven and actually helps to maintain a more consistent temperature within that oven, more efficiently heating the food that you might be preparing in that oven. You might also have experienced convective cooling if you stood in front of a fan, for instance. So a fan is blowing air by your body, and that's helping to cool your body through convection. Now, convection's often coupled with things like radiation or evaporation, which we'll talk about next. And so when you're getting cooled through convection with a fan, you probably also have evaporation occurring, and the convection is simply helping the evaporation cool your body more efficiently. So convection often is coupled with some of the other forms of heat gain or loss. Okay. The final mode of heat transfer is through evaporation, and this is when organisms have water on the surface of their body, and that water leaves the surface, and as it leaves the surface, it pulls energy with it. So this is how sweat works. So you sweat, you emit fluid from your body, water from your body, to the surface of your skin. As that water evaporates, so it gets breaks free from the surface of your body, it actually takes with it energy. It brings some of the energy from your body away, which cools you down. Right? So the same thing happens in dogs when they pant. So they're panting, they're actually allowing water from their tongue to evaporate. They're speeding that up by breathing over it, so convection. And that helps to pull more of that water away. And as that water leaves their body, it pulls energy with it. So evaporation often helps to cool organisms. So as they lose water from their surface, they lose heat from their surface. So this can happen in animals. It can also happen in plants as well. And it's often sped up through convection, through wind blowing across that moist surface. So if you are wet and you stand in front of a fan, you'll feel much stronger effect of evaporative cooling than if you are not standing in front of that fan. So evaporation, again, it's loss of water leading to loss of heat from the surface of your body. Okay, so different ways of temperature being transferred to or from organisms across different organisms. Ultimately, what does this mean for the organism? Well, organisms are exposed to variations in temperature. Now, some places around the Earth have fairly small variation in temperature. So there's some parts of the Earth that are always hot, some parts of the Earth that are always cold, and other parts of the Earth that vary dramatically in temperature. And because of this, it shouldn't be surprising that some organisms are able to tolerate very large changes in temperature, whereas other organisms have very small ranges in temperature. So the question we want to answer is how do they do this? Why are temperature swings dangerous for some organisms? So there's some organisms that when they're outside of a very small limit of temperatures, they can't survive. Whereas how is it that other organisms are able to survive very large swings in temperatures? Well, when we look at this more specifically in terms of individual organisms, we actually find that most organisms have a fairly narrow range of temperatures where they perform best. So for instance here, this boreal moss has an ideal photosynthetic rate at 15 degrees Celsius. So it's making the most food when it's in a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, this desert shrub, another photosynthetic organism, doesn't perform all that well at 15 degrees Celsius, but performs very well at 44 degrees Celsius. So different species are going to have different ideal temperatures, but you'll notice both of these have a fairly narrow range where they're performing at maximum photosynthetic rate. The boreal moss, when it gets down to 0 degrees Celsius or up to 25 degrees Celsius, it's only photosynthesizing at about 60% of what it was doing at 15. Similarly, the desert shrub, when it gets down to 25 degrees Celsius, it will also be at 60%, and it doesn't seem to survive past 50 degrees Celsius. So they each have an ideal temperature, and if you're too hot or too cold, you don't survive very well. Why is this? Well, temperature has a large control over physiology. So the ability to do things like photosynthesize, like break down the food that you eat if you're an animal, or break down the food that you've manufactured if you're a plant, your ability to do chemical reactions. And the reason for this is something called an enzyme. So enzymes are proteins that are found within an organism that help chemical reactions happen. Enzymes have temperatures where they work best. If they're in a temperature that's too high, enzymes start to break apart and they become what's called denatured. And you may have heard about this in other classes that you've taken, but what happens is the enzyme, which is typically folded, like in the graphic on the left there, will unfold and fall apart and be more like the figure on the right. And therefore, it will not function in the same way that it would at the ideal temperature. Now, at low temperatures, we get a different problem. The enzymes are not destroyed by low temperatures, but low temperatures equal low amounts of energy, and most chemical reactions require some amount of energy for them to be able to function. And so if an organism gets too cold, it will also have problems in that the reactions will just happen very, very slowly to the point of not functioning at all. So organisms can't survive in temperatures that are too low. They can't survive in temperatures that are too high. So what can they do if they're outside of their ideal temperature range? Well, they have a few options. One, they can just tolerate the temperature change. So they can just wait it out and hope that the temperature gets better. So some organisms have this strategy. Other organisms will do something called acclimate. They will have some kind of physiological, morphological, or even behavioral change that allows them to survive in temperatures that are not ideal for their chemical reactions. Now, the first option, again, is to tolerate temperatures, and some organisms do this. So, for example, hedgehogs and bears, pictured here, they will shut down their bodies in the winter, and they'll enter a state of dormancy. Now, hedgehogs will do what's called hibernate. This is extreme lowering of the metabolic process. The chemical reactions inside their body slow to almost non-existence. They have almost no metabolic activity occurring, and you could go up to a hedgehog that's hibernating and poke it, and it's not going to react much because it's essentially shut down until temperatures rise enough for it to be able to do those chemical reactions again. Larger organisms such as bears, they enter a lowered state of metabolic activity, but it's not down to the point of no metabolic activity. They're basically in a very, very deep sleep. They don't have the ability to dramatically lower their body temperature and metabolic activities to the point of the hedgehog. They still need to keep some function going. So if you were to go and poke a bear that is sleeping, you'd probably wake it up and it wouldn't be such a good idea. But they do enter this state of dormancy, and essentially they're waiting out that cold period, hoping that temperatures go up so that they are then able to raise their metabolism again and start functioning in the warmer temperatures. So again, cold temperatures are easier to survive. There are organisms, and we will talk about some in the future, that do hibernate in warm climates, but they tend to find cooler, more sheltered environments. Because again, too warm of a climate can cause enzymes to be destroyed. Too cold of a climate simply slows down reactions. So if they slow down their need for things like energy, they might be able to survive those cold climates without lasting harm. Other organisms don't want to shut down during these extreme temperature periods, so they're going to do something called acclimation. They'll be able to, for a short term, change their biology in some way to allow them to survive in these other temperatures. So for instance, there's a shrub called A. lentiformis that will actually change its temperature optimum depending on what temperature it's grown in. So if you grow this shrub in a cooler environment, you'll actually see peak photosynthetic rates occurring at a lower temperature than if you were to grow this in a hotter environment. So it adapts its physiology to its environment. And one way that a lot of these organisms are able to do this is they're able to produce enzymes that function well at different temperatures, or they're able to modify their enzymes so that they can function better. So it has an enzyme or an enzyme form that functions better at a lower temperature and an enzyme form that functions better at a higher temperature, and depending on what temperature it's grown in, it'll produce that different enzyme. So this happens in bacteria as well. Bacteria will produce enzymes that are stable to really extreme temperatures, whereas organisms that grow in colder environments like Antarctic fish must have enzymes that can function at very low temperatures. And there's even some soil microbes that can survive sub-freezing temperatures down to -5 degrees Celsius, which are pretty extreme. Now, most organisms only produce one type of enzyme, and that's the enzyme that works in the environment it tends to be in. But some organisms are able to produce enzymes that have different temperature optimums, and they'll produce these at different times. And these are what are called isozymes. So they're going to produce one enzyme one time of year that has a temperature optimum, such as in the summer they might produce an enzyme that has a higher temperature optima. And then during the winter, they'll produce another enzyme that has a lower temperature optima. And this way, they don't have to shut down in the winter. They just produce a different enzyme that functions better at that different temperature, allowing them to continue their metabolic processes regardless of which temperature they're in. Now, there's a downside to things like this. They now have to be able to produce multiple enzymes. This might cost more in terms of energetic resources than it would to produce a single enzyme. It's a much more complicated system, and we'll be looking at things like energy trade-offs in the future. And we also said that behavior can be modified, and a lot of animals do this, and you've probably done this yourself. So thinking about yourself, when it's really hot, you probably will take off clothing, you will turn on a fan, you will maybe go for a swim. When it's really cold, you put on more clothing, you start a fire, you do something behaviorally to help cope with that environment. And a lot of animals do this. For instance, elephants are known to swim or spray their bodies with water to help increase their conductive or evaporative cooling processes when they are too hot. Plants also have to be able to avoid overheating, and I wanted to look at a few different kinds of morphological changes that plants have that allow them to avoid overheating or to stay cold. So desert plants typically have the problem of overheating. There's so much solar energy, they can get too hot, and remember, if they get too hot, their enzymes will denature and be non-functioning. So what things do desert plants do to avoid overheating? Well, they have to reduce their heat gain, and they'll do this by having smaller leaves, by orienting their leaves away from the sun, by not touching the soil surface, so having their limbs and branches be off of the soil surface so they're not getting that conductive heat gain. They'll also have be spread out so that wind, as it blows across their leaves, it will cool them through convective heat loss. So they reduce heat gain through things like orienting their leaves, having smaller leaves, not touching the ground, and they increase their heat loss by increasing the chance encounters with wind. So they'll be tall, up off the ground, and allow for lots of convective heat loss. In contrast, plants that grow in a colder climate will need the opposite. They will want to decrease their heat loss, so they're going to hug the ground to prevent the wind from pulling heat away from them through convection. They will also try to increase heat gain, so they're going to orient themselves towards the sun. They're going to have broader branches that try to capture more solar energy. They're going to contact the ground to try to increase heat gain through conduction as well. So we'll see very different morphological conditions in plants that are grown in a warm environment than we do in cold environments. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about animals. And animals have several different mechanisms for regulating their body temperature. And the two big classes of animals and animal ways of regulating temperature are ectothermy and endothermy. Now, ectotherms will regulate their body temperature through exchanging energy with their outside environment. So they're going to rely on the environment around them to provide them with heat when they're cold or to help cool them when they're too hot. Whereas endotherms, on the other hand, have internal mechanisms of heat generation. So in general, organisms that you might classify as ectotherms include things like amphibians, lizards, snakes, turtles, a lot of fishes, and invertebrates. Whereas endotherms tend to be organisms like mammals, like you, birds, but also some fish and invertebrates as well. So how do ectotherms and endotherms use their different mechanisms for surviving in different climates? So first we'll look at ectotherms and then we'll look at endotherms. So ectotherms, again, rely on outside temperature sources to modify their own internal temperature. So they'll do this by moving around. So simply, when they're cold, they will move into the sun. When they're hot, they will move into the shade. And so you might notice that organisms like reptiles, like amphibians, often on a cold day, you can find them on sunny rocks, perhaps early in the morning. Whereas if it's a really hot day, you won't find them exposed as much. They'll be in the shade, underneath of trees, hidden in the leaf litter. They will kind of be hidden away where it's cooler. So this is dangerous because they have to expose themselves in order to warm up. They've exposed themselves to the sun. And so many of these organisms are going to have protective coloration, and we'll talk about how that might come about through evolution, that allows them to blend in with their background. So you'll notice lizards tend to look like the colors of the rocks that are around them, allows them to do this. So again, they modify their temperature through physically moving. They're going to move into warmer areas, they're going to move into cooler areas, and that's going to allow them to heat or cool their body through those external sources. Endotherms, on the other hand, don't need necessarily to move to help maintain their body temperature because they generate their heat internally. They will often be covered in something like fur or feathers that will help them to trap the heat that's generated through metabolism, through breaking down their food sources. And if they get cold, what they'll do is they'll increase their metabolic heat production. And they can do this through things like shivering, so movement of their muscles can actually help them to generate heat. And you've probably done this as well. When you get cold, you might shiver, and that helps you produce more heat, which can then be trapped by your clothing. What this does is this allows them to remain active in sub-freezing temperatures. So a Arctic hare, as pictured here, can actually live in an environment that is colder than it needs to function in, because it can generate heat internally. As long as it can gather enough food to maintain its metabolism, it can generate heat, trap it within its fur, and stay warm enough to maintain temperatures where its enzymes will function optimally. Now, a ectotherm, on the other hand, would not be able to survive in this environment because there's no source of energy that's great enough for it to raise its body temperature to the point where it will be able to run its metabolic processes at ideal rates. So what this means is that endotherms have been able to colonize areas that have extreme cold temperatures, whereas ectotherms tend to be relegated to areas where there is more of a source of energy. So we end up seeing patterns such as this. So this is a graphic of number of lizard species in different regions of the US, and you'll notice that areas like Maine really don't have any lizards at all. Whereas as you move further south into warmer climates, you get more and more species of lizard, and you get the highest number of lizard species in the warmest areas like the southwest US, where you can get over 20 species. Now we still, in our area, have a few species of lizard, but not a dramatic amount, because we have fairly cold parts of the year that are hard for an ectothermic organism to survive. Now there are ectotherms that can survive in more extreme conditions. They have to have additional adaptations to allow them to expand into those ranges. They might have to have things like isozymes. They'll have to have other behavioral traits that allow them to survive in those cold temperatures that we don't see in the majority of species. And we will talk about some of those extremes when we get to this chapter in class.